Hello my friends and welcome back to another Baldur's Gate 3 build guide. Hope you're all doing well. Today we're going to be covering a lore-friendly character build for Gale, using his class and subclass from the game, for Honor Mode or of course lower difficulty settings. Gale is an Evocation Wizard, and I've gone on record previously as saying that I think some of the other wizard schools are better to take over Evocation Wizard. But Evocation does get some very cool tricks and some advantages that are unique to Evocation, so we're going to talk about what those are and how to maximize the power of Gale as the Evocation Wizard that the game suggests that you make him. Evocation gets two major advantages as you level up in Wizard, and those are, one, it's just easier to play. The Evocation Wizard makes your characters, your allies, and yourself immune to damage from your own spells. Fairly early on in the history of the game, Larian actually released stats saying that the single most common death for players was their own fireballs, which was very funny to me, but also is in and of itself a great reason to play Evocation Wizard because you just can't have that happen. And not only is it easier to play, it also gives you a bunch of unique tricks built around that. You can lure enemies to stand grouped on top of your allies and then drop a fireball on top of them with complete impunity if you're playing Evocation, something that other wizard schools do not get to do. Consider, for example, casting Sanctuary on an ally so they can't be directly attacked, sending them into the middle of a group of enemies so the enemies cluster around them, and then toasting them all with a gigantic fireball from Gale off-screen. So there's a lot of cool little tricks that we can do with Evocation Wizard that aren't available to the other spell schools, and I'll talk more about those as we go through individual spells. Alright, let's get into building the lore-friendly character build for Gale, which I'm going to call Mystra's Chosen, since that's what he is. Right away, of course, we have to take a look at his stats, which, if you're playing Gale as an origin character, or if you are respeccing Gale early on, you're going to need to fix. Gale's stats are actually closer to being correct than most of the other origin characters. The wizard default stats are not terrible, and they at least have the bonuses in the right place, but he does have 3 odd numbers, and it's always incorrect to take odd numbers when you are... not always, almost always incorrect to take odd numbers when you're building stats, because only even numbers increase your actual bonus to those traits. So let's fix those and get Gale suited up and ready to roll. So we're going to swap his Intelligence to 16 and Constitution to 16, drop all these points out of Charisma because wizards have no use for that at all, and take 14 Dexterity, and then with our remaining 2 points we're going to go up to 12 Wisdom. If you're playing this as a main character, you could move some points into Charisma if you wanted more dialogue skills, or move some points from Wisdom into Strength if you want more carry weight and jump distance. But this is going to be the simplest and best build for most of the game. This gives you solid hit points, which is important for wizards because by default you get very few hit points per level, so having 16 Constitution is important, as well as increasing your Constitution saving throw, which lets you maintain concentration on spells, which is critically important for every spellcaster, and of course gets you the highest possible intelligence bonus in order to maximize the damage and DC of your spells. For skills for a wizard, you're going to want to increase any of the intelligence-related skills. Gale, of course, comes with Arcana and History from his background, and you can add Investigation and Religion as well, giving you good access to those skill points. There is also, unfortunately, a bug currently, because Gale has a floating skill point from being a human, which, if you've watched some of my previous videos, you'll notice used to appear in a second column that would allow you to respec his racial skill point. Unfortunately, for whatever reason right now, that is bugged. Hopefully that gets fixed soon, and it's not letting you respec his human skill point. A number of people have pointed this out in comments of my older videos, so until this gets fixed, you're kind of stuck with whatever he has here to start with, but the human skill point isn't that important. Once this does get fixed, I recommend either placing it in Sleight of Hand if you want him to double up as a secondary lock picker or don't want to bring someone else to pick locks, or putting it in Stealth just as the most useful spell to have, unless you want a conversation skill on your wizard. But for the most part, I would either take the last intelligence skill that you don't have access to, which would be Nature, or put it in Sleight of Hand or Stealth, which can just be useful in certain circumstances. Alright, for our cantrip selection, what you'll notice here is that there is, across the top of the cantrips bar, a row of damaging cantrips. You only really need one of these, because anytime that you're casting a damaging cantrip, you don't need to be choosing between multiple damaging cantrips. If an enemy is immune to the damage type of your damaging cantrip, just cast a different spell. Unless you're completely out of resources, you won't need multiple damage types on your cantrips. You only ever need one. There are basically two choices for good damaging cantrips. One is Firebolt, just because it's the highest damage available, and the other is Ray of Frost, which does 1 less damage on average, but reduces enemy movement speed by 10 feet, and also has the utility of being able to freeze water surfaces. Frozen surfaces are super powerful in this game, because if an enemy is on a frozen surface and moves on their turn, they have a chance to fall over, and an enemy that falls prone on their turn loses the entire rest of their turn, preventing them from acting. So if you can place ice surfaces under enemies, you can often cost them turns. Something to think about when you are playing a wizard, especially an Evocation Wizard, because it's tempting to think of yourself as just a pure damage-dealing character, is that wizards are not damage-dealing characters. Wizards are about controlling the pace, flow, and optionality of combat. That means that your best bet as a wizard is to have the right tool for the job, which will often be trying to prevent an enemy from acting in a useful way. Sometimes the right tool for the job is a fireball, and in fact, if you're against lots of little enemies, dead is the strongest, the strongest crowd control condition that you can apply. But if you're against single, more powerful enemies, then a fireball that just does damage to them may not be the best use for your wizard's turn. You're looking to control the pace and flow of combat by having the right tool for the job. The classic analogy is that if a monk or a fighter is Superman, who can punch really hard, maybe has a couple extra tricks like X-ray vision or whatever, a wizard is Batman, whose whole shtick is having the right tool at the right time. If you need a grappling hook, your wizard has a grappling hook. You need a batarang, your wizard's got a batarang. Because you can prepare different spells for different occasions, the power of a wizard is in their versatility more than their raw damage. Evocation Wizards play into this by allowing you to use raw damage in ways that other characters can't, by grouping up enemies on top of your allies and still hitting them with AoE damage, letting you control the pace and flow of combat that way. For that reason, I'm going to recommend that your damaging cantrip is Ray of Frost, which gives you a little more utility, and that you also take Minor Illusion, extremely important because you can use it to group enemies for AoE spells, and Mage Hand, which is just excellent utility throughout the game. For our spell selection here, the most important ones to have access to at level 1 are Shield, which you absolutely need. It's the single best defensive tool in the game. Increasing your armor class by 5 makes you, which you can do reactively when you are about to be hit, makes you immune to just about every attack. You're very, very likely to be able to dodge attacks with this, so it's extremely useful. Grease, for the reason that I mentioned, where enemies fall prone if they're on surfaces that can cause them to fall prone. Ice Knife, which is damage and also creates an ice surface, so you don't necessarily need both of these, but I like to have access to both of them. Magic Missile, which is an evocation spell that does great damage and is 100% reliable. This will always hit, will always do damage. Nothing can stop it except for the shield spell. And having access to an ability like that is extremely important in multiple situations. Longstrider, which is a ritual spell, meaning it doesn't cost an action and increases a character's spell by speed by 10 feet for the entire day. Extremely strong for any character to have access to, and very important for your party to have somewhere. Might as well be on your wizard, who can just swap out spells whenever you need them. And finally, I suggest taking Chromatic Orb on an Evocation Wizard. Again, this gives you access to an ice surface while also doing very good damage. So you'll notice we have 3 ways to create surfaces. One thing to keep in mind about these surfaces, though, is that your Evocation Wizard feature, which we'll get next level, does not make your allies immune to surfaces, but does make them immune to the damage of the spell. So just bear in mind that that's very important to consider when you're placing your spells and what surfaces you're placing under allies. Another thing to keep in mind, of course, is that you are able to, you are always able to learn spells from scrolls, and so which spells you select on level up should be based on what spells you have access to, on what scrolls you have access to. You'll notice that not every wizard spell is available on this level up screen. The reason for that is that when you respec your character, you keep any spells you've learned from scrolls, so Gale here has learned a few spells from scrolls already, so you should make these selections based on which scrolls you've already found, choose ones that you haven't, and then you can learn every spell in the game from scrolls. Another spell that's really useful to have is Thunder Wave. This you can use even on allies now, because at level 2, so you can move up into melee and push a bunch of enemies while leaving your allies unharmed, because this is an evocation spell, so your allies will ignore it. Enhanced Leap is very good, and Fog Cloud is excellent utility. You can blind and stop enemy ranged attackers, block line of sight. Your typical prepared spells at this level are going to be... notice that we have these extra spells showing as available. They're not currently available, but these are just the ones we've learned from scrolls, so ignore those. Your typical prepared spells are going to be something like Shield, Magic Missile, Long Strider, Chromatic Orb, and Expeditious Retreat. Something along those lines that will give you a decent amount of options in combat. Remember, though, always that you don't have to follow these prepared spells lists exactly. You can always change your prepared spells at any time outside of combat, and you should be doing that frequently to make sure you have the right spells prepared when you go into combats. At level 2, the best spells for you to have access to here are going to be things like Flaming Sphere. Flaming Sphere creates a summon, which enemies will target, and that lets you control the pace of combat very well, because causing enemies to target it is very dangerous, or very useful to you. Cloud of Daggers is also extremely powerful. As an Evocation Wizard, you also get access to Scorching Ray. You can then replace Expeditious Retreat with Misty Step, because it's also a bonus action escape spell. Scorching Ray is just the best damage available at this level to you, so that's very useful. And you probably want to replace one of these other spells, like Chromatic Orb, with Flaming Sphere, to make sure that you are always able to cast that in combat. You'll notice that these spell list recommendations do not differ that much from other wizard spell list recommendations I've made, and that's again because what Evocation Wizards give you is versatility in combat, but you are still just a fully functional wizard all of the time. You don't have to just only take damaging evocation spells, and in fact, you shouldn't. Here in... I'm going to make a choice for your feat that is going to differ somewhat as to whether you are on Honor Mode or on lower difficulty settings. On Honor Mode, I think most characters should strongly consider taking Alert with their first feat, basically no matter what. Yes, you get lower damage and spell save DCs, but Alert gives you +5 to initiative and the inability to be surprised, which is extremely powerful for Honor Mode, because you can always run away from combat. Also, it means that you never get surprised, even through story events that make it likely for you to do so. And because wizards have powerful control effects, one of the best things they do is stop enemies from acting, going first is really important for wizards. So on Honor Mode, I would recommend Alert. On lower difficulty settings, you could consider taking just 2 intelligence, or you could take something like Warcaster to give you advantage on concentration saves, but I think the most powerful option for most characters, and the safest option, is to take Alert at level 4 if you're going to get access to 3 feats during the game. For our spells known, again, just take whatever you haven't found good scrolls for. Web can be very useful, and of course out-of-combat utility spells. Gust of Wind is nice. This is another one that allies will automatically save against. And for our cantrips, we're going to take True Strike just to annoy everyone in the comments, because I like to do that. At level 3, the most important spells to have access to on your wizard are going to be Counterspell. Again, extremely important, even though you're not an Evocation Wizard. Now you get 2 of the best reactions in the game, in Shield and Counterspell. Preventing enemies from acting is your whole purpose as a wizard, so having access to Counterspell is really good. Haste, although it's less important for Honor Mode, since the number of attacks that allies get is nerfed on Honor Mode, but Haste is still very important. And of course you're going to want Fireball as an Evocation Wizard. This lets you do all of the things we talked about, use Minor Illusion or a Sanctuaried ally to group enemies and then drop a Fireball on their heads. I'll talk about prepared spells and stuff as we go, but those are just some really good options for what you're going to pick. We'll also make sure that we have access to Haste, and another spell that I think is really worth mentioning, even though it is a Conjuration spell rather than an Evocation spell, is Sleet Storm. It's a concentration spell that creates a gigantic ice surface, and we already talked about why ice surfaces are good. It also disrupts concentration of spellcasters, which is fine, but the most important thing is that it creates a gigantic ice surface. You can also cast Sleet Storm, drop concentration on it, which will create a puddle, and then freeze that puddle with Ray of Frost to create a long-lasting ice surface. So if the ice surface gets melted by something or struck by a flaming weapon or something, you can always refreeze it because it'll make a gigantic water surface. You could also electrify the water surface. Again, keep in mind that allies will have to make saves against this. You should always check what spell school a spell is, which you can see right here, because only evocation spells do allies get to avoid the saves against. For prepared spells at this level, we're going to want something along these lines, plus the addition of Fireball, Haste, and Counterspell. Sleet Storm is also worth considering, but for the most part, I think these are going to give you the best options. Haste, you can also self-cast to allow you to cast 2 other spells in a turn. So if you want to pre-cast Haste on yourself before combat, you can then cast, say, a Fireball and a Scorching Ray on your first round of combat, increasing your damage output significantly. At Wizard level 7, we're going to get access to another set of good spells. I'm going to here take Confusion, which is just a very powerful control spell, and Ice Storm, which is very similar to Sleet Storm in that it creates a gigantic ice surface, but doesn't require concentration, and also has the advantage of being evocation, so if you catch an ally in it, they won't take damage from it. So we can replace, if we were to take Sleet Storm, we could replace it with Ice Storm, but the most important spell to get at level 4 is Wall of Fire. There's a lot of encounters that Wall of Fire just solves on its own entirely. Any encounter where enemies have to come at you, they can run through the Wall of Fire. 5d8 damage is a lot of damage. And because you're an Evocation Wizard, let me actually just drop out of character creation really quick and I'll show this to you. Because we're an Evocation Wizard, our allies can safely stand in our own Walls of Fire. So we could set up something like this. And while they are taking 1 damage from being on the fire surface, they're not taking any damage from the actual Wall of Fire. This means that even Gale himself can stand safely in his own Walls of Fire, although, as you see here, you might lose concentration from taking damage from the fire surface. So don't count on that, but you at least won't take damage from that. This is more useful to set up on top of an ally, where you can prevent the ally from taking damage, and you can see through Walls of Fire just fine, so an archer ally, for example, inside a Wall of Fire is safe from melee enemies who will have to charge into the fire to get at them, and can continue to shoot arrows and so on as you go. Of course, the save DC for the burning damage is also only 10, so if you have boosts to your concentration save through additional Constitution, for example, or through having taken Warcaster, you can pretty safely stand in your own Walls of Fire, but that's not something that I like to count on because even the chance of rolling a natural 1 and losing concentration on your spell is pretty bad. So you're usually going to want to use that trick on an ally rather than on yourself. But very useful to be able to do that and to cause enemies to run into the Walls of Fire to come after you. Wizard level 8, we're just going to increase our intelligence, making sure that we get this to maximum as quickly as we can, and for our spell selection we're going to fill out other good spells that we might want, like Greater Invisibility, Banishment is very powerful, Conjure Minor Elemental gives you day-long summons, which are always good in this system. Anything along those lines is extremely good. At Wizard level 9, we get access to 5th level spells, and the Evocation spell we get here is Cone of Cold. This isn't an amazing one. It does decent damage, but compared to sustained damage from a Wall of Fire or just upcasting a Fireball, it's not that much better. And it's shorter range and a harder AoE to land, but it does have the advantage that as an Evocation Wizard, you can run close into melee combat and hit a bunch of allies with it, and they will not take any damage from it. So we'll still probably want Cone of Cold. Additionally, you're going to want Conjure Elemental, which gives you another day-long summon. You don't have a ton of great uses for your 5th level spell slots, so spending one of them on a day-long summon is extremely powerful here. Other spells that are worth considering preparing at this level, something like Conjure Elemental. You can take Confusion. You can go back for Hypnotic Pattern, which is the best control spell in the game. Just stops enemies from acting for 2 turns. You could also take Lightning Bolt if you want an alternative to Fireball. Lightning Bolt has the advantage that wet enemies take double damage from it, which I cover in more detail in my one-shot Lightning Lord build. Another thing to point out, incidentally, just while I'm talking about spells, is that you might think Cloud of Daggers is really good because allies won't take damage from it, but unfortunately they will take damage from it because even though it's a damaging spell, it's a conjuration spell rather than an evocation spell. However, it's still just a great spell because it's guaranteed damage. Enemies get no saves against it, so it's just very powerful in that respect. At Wizard level 10, you get another cool trick for being an Evocation Wizard, which is Empowered Evocation, allowing you to add your Intelligence modifier to damage rolls with any Evocation spells. This is a minor bonus for most spells, but there's a couple that it really helps with because this is every single instance of damage that you fire with an Evocation spell, it adds again. So spells that multi-shoot, like Scorching Ray, or most particularly Magic Missile, let you apply this bonus multiple times. Magic Missile that increases the damage based on your intelligence for every missile is super powerful because it's guaranteed lots and lots of damage, and you can decide how much damage you need based on the health of your enemies. So you can, if you need to, spend a spell slot of an appropriate level with Magic Missile to drop an enemy for the exact amount of damage that you need. You will get very good use out of this with the Evocation Wizard's specialty because this is 100% guaranteed damage, and the ability to just say, okay, you take 40 damage guaranteed is extremely powerful for every character, especially against bosses and so on that might otherwise have ways to get around these damage instances. Also, spells like Magic Missile and Scorching Ray that do multiple damage instances are really good for removing stuff like enemy arcane wards or whatever, things that prevent single instances of damage. There's a couple bosses that will do that, and so having these multi-hit spells available is very good for those reasons as well. Wall of Stone is another spell that can solve certain encounters. It's one I always like to have access to, so it's a good one to pick up. And then Cloud Kill, while a conjuration spell, is a good way to do damage, so it's probably worth taking. Here you might want to take just another utility cantrip, like Blade Ward has some utility, or Light. At this point in the game, though, you've pretty much figured out what you need. You could just take Firebolt, for example, as well. That will give you 3d10 fire damage, which is pretty nice. At Wizard level 11, we get access to 6th level spells, and the best one of these for an Evocation Wizard is Sunbeam, which gives you 10 turns of firing 68 radiant damage, blinding any enemies in the area, and you can continue to fire these with impunity into combat every turn for 10 turns, as long as you don't drop concentration. Repeated blinds like this are extremely powerful. Forcing the enemy to make a save against it over and over again is really, really good. Of course, there's also the options of Wall of Ice, similar to Wall of Fire, which deals a bunch of damage, but your allies can ignore it. Also similar to Wall of Stone in that dividing an encounter in two can be extremely powerful. Autoluke's Freezing Sphere is a good way to deal damage that your allies are immune to, but generally speaking, Sunbeam is going to be more efficient. And of course, Chain Lightning is just very good damage overall. Doesn't benefit from being an Evocation Wizard, but still just a very good spell. I think that the one that matters the most is Sunbeam, so that's what I'll select here. Although, of course, again, you're going to change out your spells based on what you find scrolls for. Finally, at Wizard level 12, we get to max out our Intelligence, and pick the other two spells that we haven't taken. Create Greater Undead is also pretty nice. The Mummy just gives you another option for the entire day, which is also very useful. So all of these spells have their places, but I think typically you're going to want to spend your max level spell slot on an Evocation Wizard on Sunbeam, because that's one that actually benefits a lot from being able to fire it into combat with your allies. For gear for Gale, wizards are very gear independent, but one thing that you are going to want to keep an eye out for is that Gale, as a human, has access to shields and light armor by default. That's why we never bothered to take mage armor or anything like that. And so you're going to want to get his AC pretty decent with a shield and light armor. There are good robes that you'll end up wearing in the late game, and when you are doing that, you could consider using mage armor, but the shields are very powerful as well. Anything that increases your spell save DC and spell attack rolls, like this shield, for example, is extremely strong. Basically anything that says save DC on it is something that you should keep an eye out for. Of course, the best weapon in the late game is going to be Marka Heshkir, the legendary staff, which is here. That is designed for wizards to use and deals a ton of, gives you access to 6th level spells on a short rest. Very powerful. That's going to be best in slot for your staff. Early game, actually, a staff that I think that's underrated is Nature's Snare. I forget exactly where you get this, somewhere in the Druid Grove, I assume. But it gives you a chance to ensnare the target. And that's on anything that has an attack roll. So if you fire a firebolt at them, then you have a chance to ensnare. Ensnare is a super powerful control effect, so this gives you a lot of utility on your cantrips as well. And of course, just anything that gives you bonus save DC, bonus damage on whatever is very powerful. Alright, my friends, I hope you've enjoyed this look at Gale and this lore-friendly guide to an Evocation Wizard. And as always, if you have, do feel free to leave a comment, rate the video, and of course you can subscribe to my channel for more of this and other strategy game content. Cheers, folks, and I'll catch you next time.